Hey there, with rising inflation, rents and recession fears, some governments are deciding now's the time to introduce industrial legislation reform. But will that place unnecessary burden on business when they can least afford it? I'm Aaron Young, let's get started.
Now from our headquarters at Ticker Park, this is Ticker Today.
Hello and welcome. Okay, so the Australian government has introduced its Closing Loopholes Bill, which it says aims to stop wage theft in the economy. Surely a noble cause, but with businesses doing it really tough right now, is now the right time? And what could be the cost to the economy and to entrepreneurs trying to start out? To discuss, we're joined by Will Banks, Executive Director of Schillings Capital, and Matt Grudnov, Senior Economist at the Australia Institute. Gentlemen, great to have you with us. Will, I'll start with you. Talk to us about what the legislation is trying to achieve.
Yes, I agree. It's a noble cause. It's all around protecting the gig economy workers from what they call wage theft, which is essentially deliberately underpaying short-term temporary workers as opposed to those that are on permanent contracts. It's going to change the definition of what casual employment means. It's going to create minimum standards for those individuals to be treated more like employees. It's going to have significant changes to the Fair Work Act. It's actually going to create a different class of workers now. And some of the fines that are going to be available are heightened. The only thing I would say is that it doesn't really attempt to deal with the superannuation problem, which super equates to around about $5 billion a year in terms of the issue, whereas the wage theft is around about just under $1 million. Sorry,
yeah,
$1 billion.
Matt, talk to us your views on this as well. I know that there are a lot of different views about whether or not this is going to make life a lot tougher for people who are running businesses as well. What's your view on it?
I don't think this is aimed at smaller startups. I think this is actually aimed at big existing businesses that have been basically trying to scam the system in order to pay their workers less. The government in particular has mentioned Qantas. We've had a situation where people on the same flight doing the same job being paid entirely different amounts, working for different companies. And basically what we have is a situation where some large corporations have basically restructured themselves in order to come up with better ways in order to underpay their workers. I mean, I think that's what this is mainly aimed at. I don't think it will necessarily affect startups. We'll have to wait and see what that is. I don't think that's who the government are targeting. So even if there are some unintended consequences, I think they probably have a good case to amend the legislation going forward. But my own feeling is it won't affect startups, particularly in smaller business, as much as who it's actually aimed at, and that is big business. And we need to remember, in Australia, over the last decade, we've had a period of really sluggish wages growth. Even though we've had quite low unemployment, it's clear that the pendulum, the IR pendulum, has swung way in favour of employers at the moment. It does need to come back. But as we bring that back, I agree, we need to be aware of unintended consequences.
I have to jump in there though, because if you have a look at the Fair Work Commission, Labor has put in a whole bunch of union members there. You've obviously got taxes that have been continuing to rise as well, and lots of levies too that businesses are dealing with as well. Thousands of businesses, I think it's 7,000 businesses in Victoria collapsing at the moment each month, many of them small and medium. And while we talk about unintended consequences, we are essentially going to end up with a highly unionised workforce and businesses trying to find their way in dealing with that. And the unintended consequence of that, no doubt, will be that businesses will be finding ways to do more with less staff.
Yeah, look, absolutely. But we need to remember that, firstly, Australia union membership is going down. And we need to remember that over the last 10 years, real wages have actually gone backwards. Inflation over the last 10 years has been more than wage increases. And this is, to be clear, at a time when we have unemployment that we have not seen until the middle of the 70s. Back in the middle of 70s, I can tell you that the labour market felt a lot tighter. Not that I was alive back then, but it was a lot tighter and wages were growing a lot faster than they are right now. Whatever the rules, the institutional rules as we currently have them are not enabling workers to get a decent pay rise, and we're seeing the profit share increase. That is, the amount of money going to profit is going up, and the amount of money going to wages going down.
All right, let's talk about the situation that is happening at the moment with housing, because, of course, it's not only commercial rents that have gone up as countries around the world face a housing crisis. The government just pledging $10 billion to address the issue, but will it be enough to fix the problem? And will the price tag create further issues down the line? Will, I want to get your thoughts on this and connecting it to the previous story, because obviously we're talking about real wages over the past 10 years. But the issue has been is the price of housing has been going up, whereas wages just simply haven't. And by pushing up wages to try and deal with inflation, obviously can push up inflation as well.
Absolutely. I mean, one point I would say is that in terms of wage increases, the minimum wage has actually gone up much more than the inflation rate. So that does largely offset quite a bit of that. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting package. There's not a lot of clarity around where they're going to build these houses. I don't really get some of the numbers. I mean, if you look at the average cost in Australia to build a house, it's $473,000. They've got a budget of $333,000, and they've also got to buy the land as well. They're offering to build 30,000 houses when actually there's a shortfall of about 640,000 houses. So they've not even touched 5% of the issue. So it's an interesting package, but I just feel that I'm not sure how much of an impact it's going to have, because it hasn't really been, I don't think it's been completely thought out. I mean, if you look at some of the responses from government, they still don't really know how they're going to roll this deal out.
Yeah, Matt, your thoughts on this, because it's often been up to the private sector to be able to deal with housing. It's somehow led to a bit of a housing crisis. I speak to a lot of developers who say the cost that the councils are putting on to buy a block of land, that is actually what is pushing up the price of building a house and constructing a house and making it near impossible for the commercial sector to be able to make a profit on it these days. What's your view? Do you think the government should be distinctly involved in the housing market, or do you think it's something that government should be creating a situation where it can work without their involvement?
Look, I think traditionally the government, when we've seen more affordable housing, after World War II, when we saw a big increase in home ownership rates, that was at a time when the government was involved in housing. They were involved in building a lot of housing. We saw them withdraw that support from the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. I think the government does need to get back into building housing, or at least supporting the construction of housing. That's one side. That's the supply side. I think the demand side, particularly the demand in Australia for investors, mum and dad investors, to get in and buy housing is also part of the problem. And both sides of politics seem completely unwilling to do anything around the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. I think if we want to see more people own their own home, then we need to see less people buying investment properties, because the more investment properties you have, the larger a group of renters you're going to have. There are a lot of renters out there who would really rather be homeowners, and we need to be encouraging them and helping them get into homes that they own rather than get into houses that they rent.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, Matt. I often look at Australia and say we don't have enough cities, and that's why the cost of housing has become so expensive, because people are predominantly focused on wanting to live near the water, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and the price of housing has gone up. Do you think this is an issue where we need to be essentially trying to convince more people to build and buy in places like Adelaide and Perth?
Possibly. I think what we saw in the pandemic was we saw an exodus out of the big cities into the regions. And I think all that did was transfer the housing affordability problem from the cities to the regions. I think the problem is we need two things. We need more supply of housing. And I think that there's a whole a conversation to be had around the density of housing, particularly in the big cities, but not just in the kind of right in the middle, and not just huge skyscrapers, but kind of that medium density in sort of the ring outside of the very centre. And we need to have a discussion about whether or not we want to be a country where most people rent their whole lives, or whether we want to be a country where people own their own home.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to go down the rental market side, where people do spend all of their life renting, and there are countries that do that, then we really need to strengthen renters' rights. If we want to continue down the idea that most people go and own their own home, and renting is basically just a step to home ownership, then we need to look at whether or not we need
there, I'm
a
afraid.
whole...
We're over time, Matt, but appreciate it. We'll talk to you guys again soon. That is a program for now. For more, head to tickernews.co. I'll see you.